Michael Cohen's attorney, Lanny Davis, is with us now. Mr. Davis, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I don't have to remind you, your client once famously said he would take a bullet for Donald Trump. Now it seems, in a sense, he is the bullet. Does he have damaging information against the president, and is he willing to tell it to prosecutors?
Well, he said under oath the most damaging definitive information yesterday that the President of the United States directed him to commit a crime, meaning the President committed the crime and covered it up because he didn't sign the check to keep quiet the affairs with the two women. He asked and directed, is the word used, Michael Cohen to do so. And in case there's any problem here understanding, there's no dispute on the word direction. His attorneys wrote the special counsel and said that President Trump directed Michael Cohen to do this. So the issue of whether he's credible or not has no relevance here. His lawyers are his witnesses against the president as complicit in this crime.
But let me ask you, because Michael Cohen, it's his word, and as you say, Rudy Giuliani seems to back that up with some prior statements saying that, yes, in fact, the president knew that these payments to the porn star, the hush money, were being made. But does he have any other evidence, anything to corroborate it? Are there documents?
Yes.
He does. What kind of evidence?
100% definitive. The fog of Rudy Giuliani, who says truth isn't truth, is creating simply is contradicted by the president's own lawyers wrote a letter to the special counsel.
But over
and that is evidence definitively when your own lawyers are testifying against the client. That's called definitive evidence. Okay. They said to the special counsel, President Trump directed. The word that was used in court yesterday. So there's no dispute on that.
I get that. Is there anything else? Documents, recording, anything else?
I don't know the answer to that question. We'll see whether there's other evidence. But I am saying that right now Michael Cohen needs help from the American people to tell the truth. And we've set up a website, michaelcohentruthfund.com, to the GoFundMe site. And this is about Michael Cohen telling the truth, but President Trump's own lawyers are corroborating what Michael has said.
Let's talk about Michael Cohen. I mean, for years and years, he was as thick as thieves with Donald Trump, again, saying, I'll take a bullet for him. What changed? He's now admitting things he previously denied publicly. When did he turn on Donald Trump, and why? Gradually
after the election. And when he called me, we talked about almost nothing but that question, that very important question. He's turned his life from what he did for Donald Trump, much of which he now regrets and would love to do redos. But he decided fundamentally that his family and his country were his priorities when he first was interviewed by another network. He said that, and that's the turn in his life, hitting the reset button to tell the truth from now on. And what caused that is a complicated evolution, but he certainly found Donald Trump as president to be unsuitable to hold the office after Helsinki. He worried about the future of our country with somebody who was aligning himself with Mr. Putin in denying what his entire intelligence community, his own appointees have said is an indisputable fact, that Putin interfered with our presidential election on behalf of Donald Trump, and he still denies that. That's the kind of thing that caused Michael Cohen to change his mind and decide to dedicate himself to telling the truth to the American people. And we have set up a website, michaelcohentruthfund.com, to help him and his family get through this while he tells the truth about Donald Trump.
Last question. There's one person who could make Michael Cohen's legal problems go away in an instant. It's Donald Trump. Is he hoping for a pardon from President Trump?
Not only is he not hoping for, he would not accept a pardon. He considers a pardon from somebody who has acted so corruptly as president to be something he would never accept.
Lanny Davis, thank you for your time, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hello, Today fans. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking that button down there and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives.